Coming up, 2021 was a notable year in Indian country, from the selection of Secretary Deb Holland to lead the Interior Department to major aid for tribal nations. We're joined by the president of NCAI and ICT's deputy managing editor to break down the news from this year. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews plus headlines from Indian country today.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. On Wednesday, the Biden administration announced it will continue to pause payments on federal student loans. Millions of people were set to begin resuming their payments at the end of January, but now they won't have to pay until May 1st of next year. The news comes as the Omicron variant creates a new surge in COVID-19 cases across the country. For students like Maili, the pause on payments was a relief. She graduated from Stanford during the pandemic and shares how student debt has impacted her.
Yeah, I think the current situation is really unfortunate because it definitely takes a toll, at least on myself and on my family. I'm married and my husband also went to Stanford. And luckily he received financial aid, so he doesn't have student loans, but I do. And I'm also anticipating doing further education. And so it really does shape how we see the future. Right now, we have to live, I think, a little more frugally or just be really aware and mindful of our spending. And it's going to be a lot more difficult to go on to, say, law school or graduate school because we'll really have to prepare and anticipate 3 more years of education.
The total debt from student loans in the U.S. is more than $1.37 trillion, according to data by the Department of Education. Effects are being felt following the most powerful typhoon to hit the Philippines this year. On Tuesday, local officials requested food and other aid as the death toll grew to at least 375. According to the National Police, 50 others are still missing. Officials, including the country's vice president, visited devastated areas like Dinagat Island to see the damage firsthand. Typhoon Rai packed sustained winds of 121 miles per hour, with gusts of up to 168 miles per hour. Elders from a remote Canadian First Nation are concerned about youth losing their hunting and gathering skills. Now they are working on a plan to encourage young people to eat traditional foods. One elder from the Bloodvein First Nation said, quote, "We want our grandchildren to know that wild meat is way better and healthier than a burger from a fast food outlet." Colleen Rajat has the story.
Up until 4 years ago, travel to the Bloodvein First Nation in the spring and the fall was usually a no-go. Then this all-weather road was built. Before that, the community was only accessible when the lakes froze, forming a frozen highway. The new road means travel has opened up for Indigenous people who live in this area. Over at the community hall, things are busy. Elder William Young is hosting a feast today. He's sharing all of his rabbits from his trapline. Elders say youth need to learn that traditional foods are accessible out on the land.
Oh, so important because that's who they are. They have to know their history and how people survived and their sustenance that came to be where they are today.
There are 2 types of rabbit soup. One is a flour broth and the other is made with oats.
It's good. It looks good. Super.
Type 2 diabetes rates among Indigenous adults who live on reserve are almost 3 times the rate of the non-Indigenous population. One risk factor is difficulty accessing nutritious food. Elder Emily Youngsky grew up on wild meat. She worries that young people think food comes from a tin can. Elders say it's time to go back to the old ways. It's minus 22 and youth are learning to make Labrador tea, a traditional medicine that was harvested from the land.
Cleans your insides out, and it's also a health benefit as well.
Some youth aren't too sure if they like it. Elders say land-based cultural teachings are critical to healing past traumas from things like residential schools. They plan on expanding this program to include things like medicine picking and teaching kids how to cook more traditional foods like a roasted beaver tail. For Indian Country Today, I'm Colleen Rajat on the Blood Vein First Nation in northern Manitoba.
And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, Indian Country's Year in Review. From politics, tribal sovereignty, and journalism, we're joined by the president of the National Congress of American Indians and ICT's Dalton Walker. Fawn Sharp has led the National Congress of American Indians since 2019. She is the third woman in the history of the 77-year-old organization to be president. She's also the vice president of the Quinault Indian Nation and was previously a 5-term president of her nation. President Sharp is the first tribal leader to receive State Department diplomatic credentials for the UN Climate Change Summit, which was held in Scotland. President Sharp, welcome to our newscast. It's so wonderful to have you here. I know there's so many news stories to choose from, but let's start with the good news that came this year from Indian Country. In your opinion, what are some of the major highlights?
Yes, certainly your mention of the United States acknowledging and recognizing the sovereign standing of tribal nations to have a seat at the global table on issues like climate change, the most pressing issues facing not only Indian country, but all of humanity. That was quite significant. I think also many of the appropriations that we received to contend with not only COVID-19, but infrastructure investment in the Jobs Act. Our prior leaders have worked for decades to try to achieve some of the things that we accomplished this year, and we're about to deploy billions of dollars into Indian country on long-standing infrastructure needs. But we're just beginning with this next chapter of trying to restore not only the sovereign standing of tribal nations, but to hold our trustee accountable to fully fund those things that have been gone on for decades and generations without adequate funding.
We started this year with the previous presidential administration, the Trump administration, and now we are almost in a full year of the Biden administration. How would you characterize the relationship of NCAI under the two presidential administrations?
Yes, certainly under the Biden administration, the relationship that we have with the United States is one in which we are directly engaged. We have been working with this administration on contending with the impacts of not only a global pandemic, but restoring our standing with respect to treaty rights, with respect to sacred sites, with respect to our standing to have a decisive say on these critically important issues. And this administration has been responding at every turn and in every corner on the agenda that we are advancing through the National Congress of American Indians. So it's quite exciting to be able to look at the issues that confront Indian country, as well as our friends, allies, neighbors all across the United States, to have an administration that not only hears and understands the challenges that we're facing, but to look from our perspective and to understand our vision for how we want to confront those challenges, and then enlist all of the federal families behind our vision of how we want to address the challenges facing Indian country, because they're unique and they really need to know and understand our perspective if we're to truly solve some of these challenges.
Talking about solving challenges in 2021, are there any specific areas where you feel like Indian country was left out of policy or legislation? What were some ways that Indian country could have worked harder to improve on? What were some of the bad things?
Yeah, some of the things that I think we need to continue to press and improve on is the standing of tribal nations relative to state and local governments when it comes to accessing those dollars that have been appropriated. Now, I'll just give you a couple of examples. When there was a large investment from Congress into FEMA to contend with the impacts of climate change, 95% of Indian country was excluded from that appropriation, and it was by virtue of an administrative rule through FEMA from the past administration. But what it meant was we worked hard to secure through an act of Congress critically important funds to contend with climate change, and about 95% of Indian country was left out of that equation. And so those are things where we work hard at a congressional level, but as things work through various administrative agencies, we have to continue to work through implementation. Whereas state and local governments, they've been able to receive these appropriations, not only receive the appropriations, but the capacity for technical assistance to secure those grants. And Indian country has a lot of opportunity, but we have very few resources to go after the funding that's made available.
I want to talk about one of the other major headlines that came from this year, and that, of course, is the selection and confirmation of Interior Secretary Deb Holland. In your many years of being a tribal leader, how would you sort of describe the leaps and bounds of progress that has been made since she's been in office, as opposed to, never having a Native person lead the Interior Department?
Yes, let me first by talking about the experience I had in meeting with her at Interior in July. We were elated all across Indian country to witness Deb Holland emerge as the Secretary of Interior. It was quite emotional when it happened. But when I visited her in July and I stood at the end of that long hallway at Interior, walking past all the paintings of the past Interior secretaries, to not see a person of color, to not see a woman, and certainly not a Native woman. And when I came around that corner and I saw her at the end of that long hallway open the door, and even though she had a mask on, I could see her, she was smiling through her eyes. I was literally stopped in my tracks. It was such an incredible moment to walk down that corridor to the Secretary of Interior's office to see her. And that was quite, I'll never forget that moment for as long as I live. And what that has meant for all of Indian country is we have somebody who pushes our agenda, who understands there's no degree of separation. When we talk to her about the needs of Indian country, whether it's climate change, sacred sites, missing and murdered Indigenous women, climate change, having a seat at the global table, she gets it, she understands it, and she truly is a fearless champion for all of Indian country. And I'm just so very grateful every single day that we have her as our Secretary of Interior.
One of Secretary Holland's agenda items, of course, has been investigating federal Indian boarding schools. And that, of course, is an investigation that all of us are waiting to hear from and will expect to hear from next year. What do you personally think of that investigation? What do you think will come from it?
Yes, the investigation is going to be a starting point. I know that she fully understands and recognizes that her role as Secretary of Interior, while the powers are immense, there's still limitations with respect to trying to confront a centuries old challenge of boarding schools, but she knows and understands that it begins with an initial fact finding. And I believe that that initial fact finding is going to lead to other investigations. It's going to inform legislation. It's going to help us advance an agenda in which we want to hold the United States and Canada accountable for this mass murder of our children. And so I'm very hopeful and optimistic that what we're going to see this next year in 2022 is an investigation and a report, but it's going to inform further administrative, legislative, as well as judicial action.
President Sharp, so many people in Indian country have been through so much this year, of course, with COVID and a lot of other issues, of course. I want to give you the space to talk directly to Native people. What is your message to them as we wrap this year up and move into 2022?
Yes, my message to all of Indian country at the end of 2021 is to look back at the the last 2 years. And we entered a pandemic without much resource. We entered a pandemic not knowing what the future would hold. I got elected in October of 2019. I had no idea what was just around the corner at the beginning of the next year, but I was prepared and I was confident that no matter what the challenges that might confront Indian country, not only would we meet those challenges, we would emerge stronger. And I believe we are doing that in Indian country. Not only have we successfully, with little to no resources, secured resources, but we are also advancing these agendas that have been advocated from tribal leaders for decades prior to have equity, to have parity and funding, to meet the critical needs of our health and these things have been longstanding, but COVID-19 and the pandemic just revealed to the world the disproportionate impacts to Indian country. And so my message is to be hopeful and optimistic. I know each and every one of us are tired, we're exhausted, but we're going to look forward to 2022 as that year in which we take the challenges that our ancestors have fought so long and hard and seize this moment to continue to advance us. And just to remain hopeful. And I guess the last thing I would want to really encourage everyone to do all across Indian country is just to be steadfast in daily prayer, because much of what we are confronting in this day and age, whether it is confronting the horrific happenings that is so deep in our DNA with respect to the boarding schools and all of the things that, I mean, I can't even begin to talk about the consequences and what that has meant to all of us, the horrific experiences, the multi-generational trauma and the horrific experiences for each and every one of us. We have to be prepared to meet those challenges mentally, physically, and spiritually. And so I would just implore everyone to look forward to 2022 with vigilance, with knowing that we are not weak and vulnerable. To the contrary, we are strong, we are resilient, and together we can accomplish things and not only meet these challenges, but to emerge stronger. But individually and collectively, we have to be strong.
Sure. Well, President Fawn Sharp, we hope that you visit us again soon, and thank you so much for being here.
Yes, Dale Quill, thank you.
When we come back, we continue our year in review from ICT's Dalton Walker. Indian Country Today reaches 1 million readers every month, and there have been many big stories to come from 2021. ICT's Deputy Managing Editor, Dalton Walker, joins us for a year in review. Hi, Dalton.
Bonjour, Aaliyah. Thanks for having me.
What a whirlwind of a year. Tell us about the most read story on IndianCountryToday.com.
Yeah, it was a landmark year for Indian Country. Around this time each year, we round up our most read stories on our website as a reminder of what took place in 2021. Our most read article was a June story by national correspondent Marionette Pember about the Shawnee tribe's official return to the Great Serpent Mound in their homelands of Ohio. The background of that one was in 1830, the Shawnee and other tribes were removed from Ohio and relocated in Oklahoma by the Federal Laws of Indian Removal Act. And in June, during the summer solstice, Shawnee leaders spent the weekend telling visitors to the Mound's historical site, about their people's and ancestors' connection to Ohio and the Mound.
That's been a really big conversation of this year, which is this idea of returning things to their rightful owners, this theme of land back. And I know we filed a number of stories on that topic. What have been some of the other major topics to come from this year?
To back it up a little bit, you can't really talk about 2021 without starting in Washington with Deb Haaland's historic confirmation as Interior Secretary in March and related actions since by the Interior. Specifically, Holland's announcement in April of a start of an investigation into Indian boarding schools. This came after, of course, the sad news out of Canada, where hundreds of unmarked graves of Indigenous children were found at residential schools. And anything related to the Interior and follow-up news with the Biden administration usually did pretty well for our website, and the latest being Chuck Sams being named head of national parks. And it's kind of interesting to see what happens in the coming months now, since his news was the most recent as the parks falls under the Interior.
Sure. Well, 2021 was also a full year of battling the coronavirus pandemic. Tell us about how Indian Country Today has sort of memorialized all of the relatives that we've lost this year to COVID.
Unfortunately, it's hard to keep track of all who we lost because of the pandemic. You can't really talk about 2021 without explaining how the pandemic has affected Native people. We are in year 2 of the pandemic, and we approach the start of year 3 coming up. And unfortunately, Native people continue to die from complications from the coronavirus. This year, we lost more elders, tribal leaders, and other loved ones. And with the stories we were able to find, we try to tell them on our website and through our Portraits of the Pandemic series.
Sure, and that's something, of course, we'll continue to do in 2022 as we move forward. Dalton Walker, thank you so much.
Be good, Julia. Thank you.
Let's head to an art show. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, Indigenous youth are creating art to reflect the battle with COVID this year. Jonathan Sims has more.
You know it's the holiday season in Albuquerque when the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center presents its student art show. This year marks the 41st annual Native American Student Art Show for the center. This year's theme was Surviving COVID, Art as Therapy for the Youth. For just over 4 decades, hundreds of Native American youth have shown and sold some of their work here. Curator Paula Mirabal explains.
Because of COVID and the impact that this pandemic has had on all of our Native communities, as well as our public schools and charter schools and private schools, I didn't receive that many participants, but the participants who are presented here produced some amazing work. And the theme this year was Surviving COVID-19, Art is a Form of Therapy. And so the theme for me was to be able to get some insight on how this pandemic impacted our youth. I wanted them to tell us their story about how they felt during lockdown. What did they do? Did they get tired of hanging out with their siblings? Did they play video games? Did they play games? Did they read? I mean, the whole idea was for them to use art as a window into their feelings and their emotions so that they would be able to express, maybe they felt anger, or maybe they felt sadness because they missed their friends, or the other huge part to this is the loss of family. This pandemic has impacted many of our family and friends, in the form of death. And so that was part of the idea behind using artist therapy as a form of healing for them. So what you see are insights to each of what kept them going through the pandemic, what kept them going through their lockdown. And
I just wanted to do it because I didn't know what to draw, and I knew pictures meant a lot about what happened through this pandemic, and I just wanted to do pictures instead of drawing because pictures show more.
He chose which ones meant the most to him, and just seeing the dog with Wheeler with the black and white, he took that photo on his cell phone, and that photo alone says a lot.
A lot of stuff was going through my mind, and I just didn't know what to do. I was so bored. I really miss going to school now that I realized, because it's harder doing work online.
What you see are insights to each of what kept them going through the pandemic, what kept them going through their lockdown, and all of these things that they experienced, while they couldn't hang out with anybody or go anywhere. So it's a beautiful show. Please come by and visit. It'll be up until January 8th.
In Albuquerque, I'm Jonathan Sims for Indian Country Today.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This is Indian Country Today.